The recording, and we are now starting. Okay, tonight we're going to discuss the electrical properties of cancer and nutrition. Hold on one second. David's calling me from Nigeria. David? Okay, I'm going to hang up. What? I'm hanging up. All right. Okay, I'm sorry. Don't usually get calls from Nigeria. All right. Now, when people are dealing with cancer, it's a very scary diagnosis. And so I put this presentation together to cover some of the general principles of cancer and treatment to provide people a foundation. It's going to get a bit technical, so I'll probably skip over a lot of the technical aspects on the slide and just do a general layperson's description. I think that would be more acceptable to the population of people that are looking at this webinar. Now, what happens when people get cancer or their family has a family member with cancer is they often feel bogged down. Most people, if they get a diagnosis of cancer now, the first thing they do is go to the internet and type in cancer or the type of cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer. And what they wind up with are millions of pages of information. And they really don't know how to sort it out, because unless you've got a medical background, you see all this information from somebody says they got this cancer cure over here, or there's this new herb over in India that cures cancer. You can find thousands of claims for cancer treatments. So basically, if you start trying to read this, you find it's an encyclopedic task. So this is why I put this presentation together. And basically, if you want to go to sleep reading this stuff, that's up to you. Me personally, I want to die in my sleep like my grandfather, instead of like the people in his car who were screaming. Now, when you're dealing with cancer, everyone dealing with cancer is ultimately alone. They may have supportive doctors and family, but when they are lying in bed at night, they try to sleep, they realize they could die from this condition. I just want to check one thing. Is my audio coming through okay? Please type yes in if it is. We had the slides, but I just want to make sure that we're getting audio also. Okay. So basically, the person with cancer is dealing with being alone, and that's a scary state. And so if you're a clinician or a family member, you've got to recognize that that person is dealing with a lot of overwhelming emotions, and particularly the negative toxic emotions of fear, guilt, anger, and depression. And these will often interfere with a response to cancer or a recovery from cancer. And I had one person say my audio was not good, but Chris says it is, so I'm going to assume that hopefully Chris is hearing me. Okay. Now, neither doctors or the patients really know what's going on when a person has cancer, because a lot of people use cancer supplements. A lot of cancer patients, about 71% according to one study, use dietary supplements. And 53% of these do not seek the advice of their healthcare professionals about the use of these supplements. And 23% of the supplements are known to have adverse interactions with certain medications. So it's often good for the person to talk with their doctor about supplements if they're on anything. Now, my experience many times is mixed. Many doctors will say, oh, don't take anything that's going to interfere with your medication. If you have that type of doctor, you'll have to make a decision whether you want to continue with them or find a doctor that has more of a open-minded approach, because there is a great deal of a benefit, in my opinion, from using supplements with cancer. This is my opinion. Now, we're going to look at several of the properties of cancer today, electrical. We're going to look at processes that are involved in cancer: inflammation, acidity, excessive stickiness of the blood, also known as hypercoagulation. The immune cells get interfered with cancer. And so they can often go into suppression of the immune system. People often will have mineral imbalances. We're going to discuss the need for alkalinization, enzyme therapy, glucose control. This is called extracellular matrix support, the role of hypoxia, oxidative and free radical stress, and toxicity. And these are the major topics we're going to be covering in this presentation. Now, the rapid proliferation of cancer cells results in the cancer cells basically genetically expressing proteins and enzymes where they rewire their metabolic pathways. So a normal cell over here will go down certain metabolic pathways, where cancer cells will actually have DNA, will genetically express certain proteins and receptors and enzymes that will cause different metabolic pathways to take place, and these need to be addressed. So one of the things that you see is glycolysis. This is where you're breaking down glucose without oxygen. And glutamine is an amino acid, so cancer cells will often metabolize the amino acid glutamine as a fuel source, and the fatty acid metabolism changes in cancer cells. So you find that oncogenes, which are tumor-promoting genes, and tumor-suppressing genes, vie for control over cell growth and survival by changing or modulating cellular metabolism. This is going to make more sense as we further go along. This is just kind of an airplane overview for a moment. Now, glutamine is an additional fuel source for cancer cells, and glutamine is very high in high-protein diets. Now, vegetarian, low-protein diets are low in glutamine. So one of the first things you do in cancer diets is remove sugar from the diet completely. And you can also remove glutamine by going vegetarian. Now, not everybody wants to be vegetarian, but generally a high vegetable, lower protein diet will help eliminate these sources of energy for the cancer cells. So you want to first knock out sugar, and so you want to X out the sugar, and then you want to reduce the protein content of the diet somewhat. Doesn't mean you go completely off protein, because then you'll get sick. But reducing animal proteins in the diet will reduce the glutamine load, and so you basically start starving the cancer cells from their energy source. Now, targeting tumor blood supply is another thing that can be done with nutrients. And we're going to discuss that in several slides later in this presentation. So when you're looking at chemical or physical and chemical alterations in tumors, the first thing we see is the tumor starts dumping out acids around itself. And that's in the surrounding tissues around the tumor become more acidic. So the pH of what's called the extracellular space goes toward an acidic value. Next, you find the tumor will often have areas where there's low oxygen supply. Here near this blood vessel, there's good oxygen, but in the center of this tumor, you will have a lower oxygen supply. And you'll also find that the nutrient delivery into these cells is compromised by the fact that the blood vessels haven't penetrated all the way through. Now, this is one of the problems with people who are taking chemotherapy, is they take a drug and it starts killing these tumor cells that are near the blood vessels, but the areas that are not well vascularized don't receive the chemo drug, and so they continue to grow when the chemo is removed. So this is one of the issues why chemotherapy agents have problems. Now, there is a nutritional approach, and these are called flavonoids, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, which help target this tumor blood vessel growth. This is called, the growth of new blood vessels is called angiogenesis. So tumor cells will secrete chemicals that will cause blood vessels to sprout and go into the tumor. This is called angiogenesis. And one group of nutrients that can be helpful are flavonoids, which we'll discuss a little bit later. Now, first we're going to talk about some of the electrical properties. Now, there's a lot of research now on electrical therapies of cancer. And there's different types. There's electrotherapy of surface tissues where they provide, let's say here's your skin, and they'll take a electrode here, an electrode here, and they'll send a signal in. Now, unfortunately, this is only going to deal with surface tumors, and so it doesn't really get down deeper. Other people have taken needles and driven them into the tumor cells to be able to penetrate deeper into the tumor, but still you're dealing with mostly surface cancers. Now, there is a research going on. It's called nanosecond pulsed electrical fields that are able to penetrate into the interior of tumor cells. Now, these can be applied either by direct electrodes that are applied to the body. Let's say here's the skin, and you have a type of nanosecond pulsed electrical field. It's like a microcurrent machine, and it'll penetrate very deep into the tissues. Another method is called plasma devices, and so these devices actually send a field of energy that encompasses the entire body. And so you will see research both on the electrode type nanosecond pulsed electrical field therapies, and you'll see research on plasma devices. The effect of these therapies is that there's an electrical signal that goes down not only to the surface of the tumor cell, but deep into the nucleus where the DNA is, and it literally electrocutes the DNA. And this causes the tumor cell nuclei to shrink and tumor blood flow to stop. So we find that nanosecond pulsed electrical fields is another way of knocking out these blood vessels that are supplying the tumor with nutrients and oxygen. And also, in my opinion, one of the things that you can do in conjunction is to use flavonoid compounds. Welcome to GOAT. What? I don't know what happened there. Hello? David, I'm going to mute you because let's see. I think that I muted David. He just logged on, but we were getting some feedback from him. So David, you're muted at the present time, although you are logged on. Okay. So what we're looking at is we want to kill the tumor. And so you can use this electrical therapy to electrocute the tumor as well as knock out the blood vessels, and you can use nutritional compounds in conjunction with this electrical therapy that will go after these blood vessels also. So this is how you can apply electrical and nutritional therapies together. So this is an example of what I was talking about, the electrode devices being applied to the skin. And this literally will go through all the body, because what happens is the materials that make up the connective tissues of the body are electrically conductive. They're semiconductor materials. And so collagen is a semiconductive material. And so if you put an electrical signal, it'll travel all through the entire body. So we can find we can enhance the treatment of cancer by externally conducted electrodes, or what we call inductive electric fields, which are plasma devices, or even pulsed electromagnetic field devices. This is called PEMF therapies. Some of these are worthwhile, and some of them are complete junk. So it's always buyer beware. Now, the electrical field therapy in cancer will oftentimes not be as effective when mineral deficiencies are present. So one of the things that I recommend from a point of view of holistic cancer therapy is good mineralization. And so you want to be able to get the right minerals and the right concentrations in the right locations. Another issue that's often present in cancer is there's an imbalance in fatty acid metabolism. And many people will eat the wrong types of fats. They're eating vegetable oils, soybean oil, canola oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, peanut oils. These are not the right types of fats to add into the diet, particularly in cancer or in neurological diseases. The types of fats that you want to use, which we'll discuss later, are more in the coconut oil, palm oil. The saturated fats are safe, but you want to get into omega-3 fatty acids. And these examples would be flaxseed oil, as well as fish oils. Now, with fish oil, you also want to get a purified fish oil, because many fish oils have a lot of toxins because the oceans are polluted and the fish will bioaccumulate these toxins. So you want to get a fish oil that's already been cleaned, and these are purified fish oils. So these are the types of fats that you want to go toward, and you want to move away from the processed foods diet. So basically, if it comes in a package or it's fast food, you need to avoid it if you have cancer or if you have a neurological disease. My underlying training is in neurology, and I've spent 26 years, actually 28, working with nutritional treatment of neurological diseases. So this is the same things that I described for cancer are also good for neurological diseases. So characteristics of cancer cells that affect their electrical properties. David, you're making noise. Can you mute yourself, or you want me to mute you? I mute him again, so we're getting too much feedback noise. Okay. So characteristic cancer cells affect their electrical properties are the mineral concentrations, and we'll discuss mineral concentrations both inside the cell and outside. Outside the cell, we have the bloodstream, and the major mineral in the bloodstream is sodium. Inside the cell, the major minerals are potassium and magnesium. And you'll find with cancer that many people have deficiencies of magnesium and many people have deficiencies of potassium. And these are alkalizing minerals. And they have an excess of sodium. So they wind up having too much salt in their diet and not enough magnesium and potassium. So that's one of the things you want to address. And these ratios will affect the electrical properties of the cancer. You find that there's changes in membrane structure, and this occurs because the wrong fats have been incorporated into the membrane. People are eating fried foods, which is one of the worst things you can do, or they're eating processed foods, and they have trans fatty acids or hydrogenated vegetable oils in it. If it says trans fatty acid or hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oil, do not eat it. It's toxic to the tissues. Never eat margarine. Butter is actually healthy. And some of the stuff that I'm telling you is exactly the opposite of what you'll see if you read on the internet from major websites that propose dietary suggestions for cancer. Yet, you know, if these dietary suggestions these major websites were promoting were correct, how come cancer is the second leading cause of death, at least in the United States? Okay. Another thing you have are an excessive of what's called negative charges that accumulate on the surface of the cancer cell, which we'll discuss. Now, another thing we're going to talk about is the membrane potential or the battery effect of cells. Normal cells have a high voltage or membrane potential, and cancer cells have very low membrane potential. Another thing that happens are the electrical circuits that flow through the body are disrupted in cancer, and there's a change in energy production. So we find that cancer cells are basically disconnected, what I call lost in space. In healthy tissues, if this is a cell in a healthy tissue, other cells around it will actually send signals to tell it stop growing. And so the regulation of growth is an external signaling mechanism, whereas cancer cells have lost their connections to other cells, and they basically ignore these signals. They don't respond to these signals to stop growing. So these cancer cells keep proliferating and keep proliferating, despite the fact that the other cells around it might be sending signals not to stop growing. So they're basically disconnected. So we find that cancer cells are less efficient in their production of energy. And a major source of energy is sugar or glucose. And glucose can come from lots of different sources. Everybody knows about sugar. I mean, sugar will break down into glucose. But starches also break down into glucose. So a high starch diet, white potatoes, high grain diet, all are massive sources of extra glucose. Even proteins, certain amino acids can be broken down into glucose. So this is why high protein diets, while they are a source of glutamine, also are a source of extra glucose. So again, this is the dangerous factor, because this is what cancer cells live on, is sugar. Cancer cell membranes have different electrochemical properties and different distribution of electrical charges. So they basically have a different electrical nature than normal cells. We've already discussed that they have different fats content than normal cells. This results in different membrane composition and permeability. So what you find as the cancer cell grows and develops, they start becoming more permeable. And remember, I said we had the potassium and the magnesium, and we didn't mention the calcium, but these start leaking out of the cells, and you wind up with increased accumulations of sodium and water. So cancer cells have too much salt or too much sodium, and they get too much water in them. And so we find they have lower potassium content, higher sodium, and higher water content than normal cells. And this, between the minerals and the composition of membrane, is going to affect the electrical properties of these tissues. So healthy cells maintain inside of themselves a high concentration of potassium and a low concentration of sodium. And when cells are injured or they become cancerous, sodium and water flow into the cells. Potassium, magnesium, calcium are lost from the cells, and you find that this membrane potential begins to decline. And so this is an electrical property of the cell. Now this is like a battery function. So we would say the battery function of the cell is less than normal. And that brings us back to why electrical therapies have some benefit, because as you apply these types of pulsed electromagnetic fields or plasma devices or the microcurrent devices, you're sending extra electrons into the cell tissues, and they will begin to accumulate in these cell membranes, and they'll begin to raise the membrane potential off the floor back toward normal. And so basically it's a way of recharging the cells, which is one of the things that you want to do. In cancer, you want to make these cells have higher membrane voltage potential, because that affects the physical chemical nature of the cells. It affects how nutrients flow into the cells. It affects how toxins flow out. It affects how substances are transported into the cell. So it has lots of different biological effects. So we find the changes in minerals and water, sodium and water come in, potassium, magnesium, calcium leave. These cause the cancer cells to swell. And so if you've got cells that are stuck together, and this is a normal cellular structure, and they swell, what happens is all of a sudden their electrical connections are disrupted. Normally there's what they call gap junctions here between these cells. And there's actually a flow of electrons around the surface, and also there's a flow of minerals and electrons through these gap junctions between the cells in the cell interior. And so the these electrical connections have a direct influence on the metabolism that's taking place. It affects the enzyme activity of the cell. And this gets very complicated, so I'm trying not to go too deep into this where I lose people, but I'm trying to go in enough explanation that you'll understand why we're discussing this. Now we find the cells actually have a cell generator in their cell membrane. It's called the sodium-potassium pump. It pumps potassium in and sodium out, and it's in a continual cycle. Sodium's constantly leaking in, potassium's constantly leaking out, so you find out potassium is pumped back in, the sodium is pumped back out. And this can use up to 25% or more of all the energy produced by the cell. So if a cell is going to spend the considerable amount of its energy resources just maintaining the mineral concentration inside the cell, it must mean that mineral concentration is one of the most critical things involved in cellular metabolism. And this is the point that I'm making to bring out this slide, is mineralization is absolutely critical for good health, whether it's a cardiovascular disease, or a neurological disease, a muscular disease, or a cancerous disease, and others. Mineralization is critically important for the cell health to occur. So what we find is this movement of these charged particles, and the movement of charge, whether it's a negative, positive charge or negative charge, is called electricity or current. So we find that the movement of these mineral ions is actually going to create a circulating current that's going to penetrate into the cell interior and come out of the cells. Now, some of these currents are through this mineral ion pumps, and others are through wiring connections that a cell may have with, this is a protein, external protein, and there would be a intermediate protein inside the cell membrane, and then there'd be proteins inside the cell. So we actually see that, say, the mitochondria here can generate electrons that could actually flow into the cell membrane and be stored, or can flow out of the cell into other cells. So it's basically mitochondria, what could be considered the power plants of a cell, and they're actually able to generate electricity and power up other cells indirectly. And so we find in healing responses that other cells some distance away are also involved in healing. So we find that the flow of minerals through a cell will create an electrical current, and you'll find that this current will often flow into the cells, and it'll flow around the cells. And it depends on the frequency whether or not the current will penetrate in. So calcium, magnesium, potassium, there are products called mineral transporters, and these were developed by a doctor named Hans Nieper, N-I-E-P-E-R, Hans Nieper, H-A-N-S. So Hans Nieper, let me change my color here. Let's see. Let's go to red. Okay. So Hans Nieper was a scientist, medical doctor. He was a physicist and a physician, lived in Hanover, Germany. He died in 1998. But all through the 60s, up until late 90s, he was involved in developing mineral compounds called mineral transporters. And these mineral transporters have been used by millions of people. And there are different types. There's arginates, aspartates, orotates, and amino ethanol phosphates, or also called AEPs. And these are his major classification of mineral transporters. And these mineral transporters have the particular ability to direct delivery of minerals into cells. And I don't want to get off on a mineral lecture here, but if you take most mineral supplements, they get broken down in the gut, and you've got a loose mineral that just travels in the bloodstream, and it may or may not go anywhere. But mineral transporters, you can actually target heart tissue, brain tissue, bone tissue, muscle tissue, glandular tissue, depending on the transporter you choose. And so let's say you want to go to the heart, you could actually choose a product called magnesium orotate that'll actually accumulate in heart tissue. So you wind up having the mineral transporter. This creates an address on the mineral that allows orotate, orotate. I'm sorry, I'm not. It's orotate, O-R-O-T-A-T-E. And this will actually accumulate in the heart. So you can put in magnesium orotate and heart in a search engine and find several articles on that. There's one called lithium orotate that is actually used by a lot of physicians for memory, for neurological conditions. You can put in lithium orotate and brain and find articles on that. Calcium orotate and bone. So anyway, these are examples of that. So these mineral transporters allow you to effectively deliver minerals into the interior or intracellular compartment. And so these are important. And then there's other compounds, nutritional compounds, such as squalene, which is a fat found in shark liver oil, lithium orotate in small amounts, and the amino acid taurine can actually help remove sodium and water out of the cell. So this will help you rebalance your minerals. You want to take potassium, magnesium, and mostly I don't usually give potassium supplements. I give them diets very high in vegetables, which are very loaded with potassium. And that's usually how you get your potassium, magnesium, and I'll probably add some additional magnesium. And then I want to work on sodium and water elimination by energizing the cell membrane is one way of doing it with electrical therapies, or I may want to use some of these compounds here, say taurine, to help remove the sodium in water. Now, membrane pumps maintain the magnesium and potassium inside of cells, but these cells fail when there's low oxygen state, hypoxic states. Let's see, how are we doing on time here? Okay, we're doing fine. So in hypoxia, potassium, magnesium leak out of cells, sodium leaks in. So you find that the intracellular fluid dynamics are altered with the entry of large volumes of bowel water that follow sodium, and this is going to alter, this mineral changes the energetic mechanisms, and it's going to result in the development of pH changes inside the cells. And you'll find that the cells will initially become acidic, but as the cancer changes its metabolism, it starts dumping this acid out of the cell. So the pH will change. It's not just in a steady state. It can start off acidic, and then it can basically change where it moves the acids out of the cell, and the pH of the cell can become more alkaline. Capacitance is a description of the electrical property of the cell membrane. So in electrical equipment, a capacitor is also called a condenser. And you'll find a capacitor is usually two plates of conductive material separated by what's called a dielectric or an insulating material in the center. And so this material separates these two plates. And so its primary function is to store electrical energy. Well, the body is cells themselves, the membranes are capacitors, except what you find is the conductive material is the fat that makes up the membrane. I'm sorry, the insulating material is the fat that makes up the membrane, and the conductive are the minerals that accumulate on either side of the cell. And so this is why mineralization is important in controlling the electrical properties of the cell. And this is why the dietary fats that are taken in are important in controlling the electrical properties of the cell. Because in a good functioning capacitor, it's able to store electrical energy very well. So we find that there are a number of types of capacitors in the cell, including cell membranes, the mitochondria membrane, as well as photoreceptors. And this is actually a picture of a biological capacitor in a plant cell. So we find that there are also myelin is a capacitor. So the covering of a nerve, which is covered by fatty tissue, this fatty tissue has the role of being having an electrical property of capacitance. And that's why nerve conduction can take place, because it has a number of functions, but it helps promote the electrical properties of nerve tissue. So the ability of a cell membrane to store electrical charges is known as its capacitance function. And the capacitance and electrical potential arise because of the composition of the membrane, we already talked about the fats, and the maintenance of the different types of minerals inside the cell compared to the outside. So if you don't take anything away, proper dietary fats and good mineralization are critically important for restoring the electrical properties of cancer tissues. So healthy cells have a membrane potential about -60 to -100 millivolts. The negative sign means that the inside surface of the membrane is negative compared to the outside surface. I don't want to get too complicated, but sticking off of the cell are a lot of fibers and connective tissue, and these things are capped by materials that have a negative electrical charge. So while the membrane directly adjacent, the surface directly adjacent to the cell on the exterior has a positive sign as opposed to the interior of the cell, further out, there's this whole area, there's an electrically negative charge. And we'll discuss why that's important later. So when one considers the membrane potential of a healthy cell, the electrical field is enormous, up to 10 million volts per meter of surface area. Now that is, if you had 10 million volts passing through your body at the same time, you'd probably be electrocuted. But somehow or other, the body is able to control this electrical potential so it's not discharged all at one time. And if it was discharged all at one time, you would basically probably spontaneously combust. And that's a different discussion. So cancer cells and proliferating cells have lower membrane potentials that, in my opinion, are gone with the wind compared to normal cells. So we find that a normal cell has a high or strong membrane potential, and cancer cells have low membrane potential. Probably should have made this arrow the other way to make it make more sense, but I think you got the point. Now, since injured and cancer cells cannot maintain their normal membrane potential, they wind up with electrical dysfunctions that impede repair and reestablishment of normal metabolic functions. Now we begin to see that electronic treatments can actually support healing of tissue. And there's been a great deal of research on bone fractures and using magnetic inducting coils outside the body to stimulate the electrical repair. So remember, if you have a magnetic field, you're going to create an electrical field. And since tissues have electrical properties, and if I create a surface magnetic field, I'm going to create an electrical current at a 90-degree angle. So this is why they've used magnetic induction devices for bone repair. You can actually treat ulcers and diabetics that don't heal by these pads that are placed on the body around here. Let's say this is the ulcer here, and there's an electrical device that sends a positive and negative, so you wind up having a healing current flowing through this tissue, and it will actually facilitate healing. This is what I call electronic antioxidant therapy. So a key component of cell repair and cancer treatment is to reestablish a healthy membrane potential, and that's where your proper fats and minerals, and then your electrical therapy can help recharge that membrane. So we find that this is going to improve the response to other therapies. And this is why I don't have a problem using nutritional therapies in conjunction with medication therapy. The reason doctors that tell you not to use medications is because they have no understanding whatsoever about the role of nutrition and treatment of different disease states. And it's just a sad state of their education. But the average doctor only gets about 4 hours of nutritional training in the entire 4 years of medical school, and they don't remember that. And so when they get out, they have no understanding whatsoever about the role of nutrients in therapy. All they hear about is how to use a drug, how to use a drug, how to use a drug. So when you go to ask your doctor, can I do this? Many times they'll look at you with stunned silence or get angry and say, I don't want you to use anything that might interfere with your drug therapy, because they don't understand these processes. So treatments that affect membrane composition, the electrical potential, and the permeability of the membrane are going to affect energy production, nutrient entry, cellular detoxification, and repair or synthesis of cell components. So we find that any condition, illness, or change in dietary intake that affects the composition of the membranes and their associated minerals will alter the electrical properties of the tissue. We find that cancer cells have different protein structures also, different compositions of fats in their membranes, and that they have genetic expression or alterations that result in different proteins. So cancer cell literally regresses back to an earlier state embryologically, in a sense. It goes back to a primitive state like when the embryo was being formed, and starts creating proteins that are normal for an embryo in the mother's uterus, but are abnormal for an adult. So we find that there's a regression or reversion to embryological proteins. And this creates alterations in chemistry. It results in the production of materials that create a more negative charge on the very far exterior surface of the cancer cell, results in changes of the mineral content, and results in change in the communication with the remainder of the body. Now, the reason I mention that is here's a cell, and it has an internal skeleton. It's called a cytoskeleton that helps provide structure. And I'm not talking about free-floating cells like white cells or red blood cells. I'm talking about cells in tissue, let's say in the liver or lung. And you'll find that there's other cells that are surrounding this cell. And they'll have connections into the cell. And so these cells are all connected together and wired together. And the interesting thing about this wiring is it's made out of material that is electrically conductive. So you actually have a wired-in system. This would be like a house in a neighborhood, and all the houses in the neighborhood are all connected into the telephone system or connected into the power system, and they're all working on a massive and the same system. And so if the power goes out in the neighborhood, all the houses black out, or if somebody knocks down the telephone line, all the houses that are requiring wired telephones get knocked down. So what I'm trying to say is a cancer cells lose this normal communication. So in a sense, these cells and these organs are wired together, and this communication system, this liver, well, it's also able to communicate with the brain. Not only is it going through a communication through the nervous system to the brain, it's also communicating through this connective tissue system that runs through the body. Some people call it the acupuncture meridian system. Other people call it the biocircuitry system. But it also connects up to the brain and other organs. So you actually have more than one type of communication taking place, and these are electrical in nature. Now, another thing we see is these cells have surface receptors. These materials are made up of glycoproteins, sugar proteins. So these are proteins that have these small elements here of these sugar molecules attached. And so as cells specialize, let's say a cell is a stem cell, and over time it develops into a kidney cell. Well, the kidney cell is going to have specialized proteins or receptors that are unique to kidney cell, and over here this stem cell here is developed into a liver cell, it's going to have a different type of receptors on it. Some of them are going to be the same and for all cells, and then some of them are going to be unique for the tissue. And so basically these materials allow cells of the same type to recognize, communicate, and adhere to each other. So glycoproteins act as chemical receptors. But what I'm teaching you tonight also is these little protein sugar enzymes and glycoprotein receptors are also molecular antennas. They actually act as wiring devices like radio receivers or cell phone towers. They'll send out electrical signals and they'll receive wirelessly. So they are actually wirelessly communicating to all parts of the body as well as to the exterior. So other people are actually, I don't want to get too far down that road, but there's something called a biofield. If you are a living human being, you actually have a field of energy that extends out into space from your body. And if another person is in proximity to it, they have a field of energy. And at some point, at this place here, there's a communication taking place between this person and this person that they're not consciously aware of, but it is biologically happening. So this exchange of information, and this is why you get around some people that give you the willies. You just feel uncomfortable. You don't even know why. Or some people you feel instantly attracted to, or somebody who's charismatic. You just want to be near them, and because this is biological wireless transmission taking place. Now, there are a lot of books on this that you can get more in depth on this, but what I'm trying to say is at the basic cellular level, and this is based on medical research, scientific research, as these proteins act as molecular antennas and they can pick up electromagnetic signals. So we find that the body has a frequency code. Frequency plays a central role in normal cellular functions of disease, and specific frequencies may provide a code of information necessary for normal growth and healing. Now, all materials are made up of atoms, yet if you break down atoms are nothing more than basically frozen points of energy. So if you get down, even if you look at an atom, say here, and it has an electron way over here circling the atom, well, the rest of it's empty space. And so here's another atom over here, and here's this electron floating around here. And so you got all this empty space, and it's basically an energy field. And so what I'm trying to say is we're nothing more than standing waves of energy. And this is why energy medicine can have an effect on the body. And this is why things such as sunspots can affect the body, weather changes can affect the body, earthquake, geomagnetic stresses can affect the body. You can look up on earthquakes and animal behavior, and you'll find that animals will typically have some kind of alerting response or warning response prior to an earthquake occurring. And it's because the geomagnetic stresses are creating electrical fields, electromagnetic fields that are extending out in space, and the animals just happen to be sensitive to it. Some people are sensitive to weather changes. And so basically all people are electrical organisms. So we find that cells of the body appear to contain pulse code receivers and transmitters. DNA has been found to emit pulses of coherent waves that are received by the cell membrane, other DNA molecules, and RNA, proteins, and enzymes. So basically, the DNA is like a radio station sending out a signal saying, do this, do that, do this, do that, and it's wirelessly transmitting. Now, you won't find this in your regular cell biology books. You have to read biophysics books, which the cell biologists have no idea how to even spell biophysics. But the biophysics don't study cell biology. So everybody's all narrowed into their scientific field. But if you get into biophysics, you'll find all this information is starting to be available, depending on who you're reading. Now, frequency modulation may be a primary control mechanism. Frequency modulation is the same thing happens in an FM radio station. In an FM radio station, you have a transmitter that's sending out a wave of energy. This is called a carrier wave. And on this carrier wave, they embed information. This is called frequency modulation. So they're embedding information, whether it's, in this case, it's usually radio information. But the same thing happens with TV. In a TV, they're embedding audio and visual information on this carrier wave. And so we find that the body has carrier waves. We find that different frequencies of electromagnetic spectrum can be utilized by the DNA and cell membranes to affect different biochemical transmissions. And some of these ranges are in the infrared, and some of them are in the ultraviolet range. So you find there are signals taking place between components of the cells, and this is a dynamic field, and it goes all the way from low radio waves all the way up into ultraviolet, and the body is utilizing some of this electromagnetic spectrum as a communication, just as we use this electromagnetic spectrum to operate our TV stations, our radio stations, our cell phones. So here the cell phones are using microwave radiation. And so the cells of the body have an ability to utilize the electromagnetic spectrum. We find there are molecular antennas. If you look at chlorophyll, which is in a leaf, you'll find that certain components of the chlorophyll are designed to absorb at high levels specific wavelengths of energy. So here we have chlorophyll B, which is absorbing in the blue-green field, and we have this type of chlorophyll here that's absorbing in the yellow-red field, and here we have over here absorbing in the red-purple area, and so, or the red, or the deeper red. We have beta-carotene here, which is absorbing in the violet field. And so we find that specific molecules have been developed in the cells that are able to respond to specific wavelengths of light. In this case, these chlorophyll molecules are using sunlight to generate energy. Well, the same thing happens in the eye. You have photoreceptors that absorb specific frequencies of red, blue, green light, and they wind up, or red, blue, yellow, they wind up being able to develop color vision as a result of this. And so that when the wavelength of light is absorbed by, say, a photoreceptor, it creates an electrical signal that travels into the brain, to the occipital lobe of the brain. From the retina to the occipital lobe, there's an electrical communication, and the occipital lobe interprets this into vision. And this is an electrical mechanism. Same thing happens in the ear. When you hear a sound, the eardrum will vibrate, and it will activate the three bones in the ears, and they will create an electrical, there's a nerve connected here, and they create an electrical signal. So the sound is converted or transduced into an electrical signal. Light is transduced into an electrical signal. So we see the electrical nature of the body is an inherent property. And so we find in the tissues, there are molecules that have specific structures that make them antennas that are pre-tuned to exact frequencies. And this allows the energy or information to be passed. So an externally administered electromagnetic signal will affect cells when the electrical frequency of that signal resonantly matches the frequency signal the cell is already emitting or capable of receiving. So we struck this tuning fork, and this is, say, a 440 hertz A tuning fork. This one, while not struck, will actually start vibrating and sending out signals if it's in close proximity, because it's resonantly picking up the energy from the sound waves from this struck tuning fork over to here. So we find that physical match or resonance of wavelength is where the transfer of energy most efficiently takes place. So we find the physical structures of DNA and cell membranes provide targetable geometries for both active and passive systems of communication. Look at the geometry of a DNA molecule. This is not some random collection of materials. This is a specific geometric structure. The cell membrane has a specific geometric structure. So we find the DNA and cell membranes are natural resonators. We find the cell membrane is contiguous with the nucleus, and it's a liquid crystal resonator that can send and receive, or detect and receive, frequency-specific signals. So a resonator, by definition, is an acoustical, sound, mechanical, electromagnetic, or biological system whose individual parts are tuned to a particular frequency, and on being excited by a signal with this precise frequency will start to isolate and resonate with the signal. Now, when they start to oscillate, what happens is they transduce the signal into an electrical current, into an electrical signal. So this signal can be auditory. This signal can be light and vision. This signal may be mechanical, such as you dancing, and you move your muscles around, and the muscles have what are called piezoelectric properties. They will actually stretch, and they'll create electrical signals that will travel in the body. And these signals have been found to be involved in bone repair. This is why people who do active exercise, such as weightlifting and dancing, have stronger bones than people who are passive and are inactive. So the body contains liquid crystal components that possess the electronic capabilities of resonating to specific frequencies like antennas, and the biological liquid crystal molecules are organized in complex structures that exhibit cooperative behavior. So when the correct specific bioelectrical frequencies are supplied to the cells, these liquid crystal molecules will resonantly absorb information and energy. And so we find that the components that make up the cell membrane have all the components of radios. They are liquid crystal oscillating circuits. And so LC circuit is the basic component of many types of communication devices. And so we find that the receptors, the membrane, the cytoskeletal proteins behave as tuning circuits. And so you have these antennas sticking out here. That'll pick up a specific signal and generate, through its connections here, an electrical signal that'll travel into the cell. So these circuits allow detection and absorption and amplification of very specific signals that are in certain frequency and amplitude windows. So we find that cell receptors can be activated by chemical signals or by electrical fields that have particular frequencies and amplitudes. And this gets complicated, but the process is known as electroconformational coupling. And so we can actually, if you have the device properly tuned, you can have the same effect on the cell as if you submitted a drug into the system. You can actually have an effect on the cell as if you gave somebody morphine. You can use an electrical signal or a frequency signal that will actually stimulate the body the same way as an injection of morphine will if you have the signal properly tuned. So you can have lots of different biological effects by using electrotherapies. So frequency modulation of cell membrane receptors that function as electrical antennas and transducers result in voltage fluctuations. Remember, I just said they generate a signal at the frequency of the stimulus. And so we find that these receptors that respond to these voltage changes are coupled to other molecules that are coupled to the metabolic machinery of the cells. So this is why I'm saying electrical therapy can affect the metabolism of the tissue. You can actually improve healing. You can improve energy production. You can improve protein synthesis. You can improve DNA synthesis. These are all documented in the literature, going back to 82 is some of the earlier papers, and I'm sure there's earlier than that, but there's a particular one in 82 that talks about this exact process of energy, protein, and DNA. So if fields can affect enzymes in cells, one should be able to tailor a waveform as a therapeutic agent in much the same way as one modulates chemical structures to obtain pharmacological selectivity and perhaps withhold many of the side effects common to pharmaceuticals. This was 1990. So scientific principles have already been discovered that both explain passive and active resonant technology. Specific frequencies or wavelengths of electromagnetic energy have highly specific effects on tissues of the body, just as drugs have their specific effects on target tissues. So we find the cell membrane is one of the locations where electromagnetic fields act. Another location is the DNA. And so electromagnetic energies that are properly modulated, or the waveform is actually tailored, can affect the binding of chemicals to the cell, so it actually can affect the receptor activity and response to things like hormones or signaling molecules. Now, we're pretty much going to leave the electrical properties of the tissue alone for a while and go into the more chemistry. Let's say this is a tumor. Here's a blood vessel. And we see these cells very in close proximity to the tumor have a good oxygen saturation. They have a pretty much high level of oxygen. But the further away they get from the blood vessel, the less oxygenated they become. So we find that the distance of a tumor cell from a functioning blood vessel will determine its oxygen content. And as the tumor cell becomes less oxygenated, it actually changes the DNA expression and will actually start producing a product called HIF1. And this particular product has very specific effects. This is called hypoxia inducing factor. And so what happens is this tumor is now going to start cell, which is poorly oxygenated, is going to start having a different metabolic chemistry than the cells over here that are well oxygenated. And it's because the oxygen content is activating processes that are stimulating DNA to produce different substances than the DNA is being signaled to produce in these cells. And this is why a lot of times chemotherapy does not work, because the chemo may target one of these types of cells or another, but not necessarily because this has different metabolic chemistry than this, so it may kill off these cells over here, and these cells over here just keep growing. And so in chemo, a lot of times they predict success based on shrinkage of tumor size. But shrinkage of tumor size has actually been found not to have much correlation with prolongation of life. Very little prolongation. But the last time I looked into chemotherapy success, only about 3% of people really have really good success with chemo, which means that 97% have poor to little success or less success to no success. And what happens is if you're killing off half the tumor, that's fine. Here, this other part just keeps growing. But the tumor size has shrunk. So we find that acidic regions are frequently found within solid tumors, and the acids are being dumped out of the tumor cell in order to maintain the chemistry inside the cell. So you find that acidosis extracellular, it means outside the cell acids, may occur due to insufficient supply of tumor with nutrients or oxygen as a result of irregular vascularization. And so we find that a decrease of oxygen will occur when a tumor cell is distant from a blood vessel. This will lead to a metabolic switch of hypoxic tumor cells to what is called anaerobic glycolysis. And what this means is the tumor now will start breaking down sugar without the need for oxygen. And this is about 1/18 as efficient as oxygen utilized, glucose metabolism utilizing oxygen. So this means that tumor cells, in order to live, have to pump in a massive amount of sugar in order to maintain an ongoing supply of fuel. And we'll talk about how that occurs in a few minutes. But what happens is, because they're dumping out this glucose, bringing in glucose and metabolizing this glucose at a very high level, they're like a old blue smoking car. So instead of a nice performance engine, you're behind a car that's putting out clouds of blue toxic smoke, and you're sitting there coughing and going, why don't they take that car and take it to the junkyard, or take that car and get it to the mechanic and get that problem fixed, because I don't want to keep breathing this stuff. Well, what happens is the tumor cells are now dumping out a lot of waste products, and so you have a lot of metabolic waste or toxicity. And this is one reason why detoxification methods are helpful in cancer, because you're dealing with dirty metabolism. Now, tumor cells can also use glycolysis for energy production even when normal oxygen is present. So you got hypoxia activates what's called hypoxic inducing factor, and it results in a metabolic adaptation. It activates DNA, and you wind up with this metabolic activation where you increase the enzymes that are involved in breaking down glucose without oxygen. It also stimulates blood vessel growth. So you find that hypoxia-inducing factor activates DNA or induces the expression of genes that code for proteins that increase the uptake of glucose, that increase the metabolism of glucose without oxygen, which is called glycolysis, that increases the generation of lactic acid and hydrogen ions, and increases the pumping mechanisms that dump this acid waste out of the cell. So this is what hypoxia can do as far as a metabolic adaptation. So we find that glycolysis is a common property of invasive cancers, and basically glucose is converted to pyruvate and then lactate. I guess I won't go too far into this. So we find in normal cells glycolysis is inhibited when the oxygen is present. However, in cancer cells, oxygen actually doesn't really have that much effect, and so the glycolysis can continue in oxygenated and unoxygenated cells. So we find that an increase in aerobic glycolysis is almost universally observed in cancers. So glycolysis, or wasting of sugar, is one way of thinking about it. And so what the cancer cell does is it begins to have the DNA, or is it, well, I don't have a DNA in here. Let me draw one. Here's some DNA. It will create these proteins, or signal the body to manufacture these proteins that transport glucose into the cell. So you wind up having a lot more of these receptors created, and now you can have glucose come into the cell in much higher levels. So it basically is a glucose pumping station here, and it's just utilizing lots of sugar from the bloodstream. And this is why you want to starve the cancers by getting rid of foods that have high glucose content. That means get rid of sugars and and reduce the starches. You want to go to what's called low glycemic foods. Low glycemic. And there's plenty of books on this. Low glycemic foods. And this is one of the major things that you'll find that reputable research will recommend as far as dietary alterations. So we find that providing oxygen to cancer, which was originally thought back in the 30s was going to be a solution, that doesn't turn out to be that way, because glycolysis also helps provide some of the building blocks, such as new nucleic acids, which are making RNA and DNA, fats and proteins. So it actually provides the building blocks for making new cells. And so we find that cell proliferation, which means one cell dividing into another cell. So here, this cell over here makes 2, and these make 4, and 4 makes 8, and so on. We'll find it to be compromised if glycolysis was inhibited. This is why glycolysis is not inhibited in the presence of oxygen in cancer. So we find that what occurs is the tumor cells are breaking down sugar, developing a lot of acids, when they'll start pumping these acids out, which we'll show in a few slides. So upregulated glycolysis means increased glucose consumption. And you wind up with surrounding tissue acidosis, which we already talked about. Now what happens is this acidosis around the tumor cell, this acidic area around the tumor cell, actually starts suffocating normal cells. So these cells start shrinking and dying, which provides space for the cancer to proliferate in. So basically it's kind of like a chemical weaponry where it's assaulting the normal tissue and providing an environment where the normal tissue just can't live healthy and starts shrinking and dying off, and the cancer cell now develops space for itself, developing a toxic environment. It's kind of like a Superfund site. And so you wind up with developing of cancer cell types that are resistant to acid-induced cellular toxicity. So now we have cell types that are resistant to low oxygen states, and we have cell types that are resistant to low pH states. And this is why you get more than one type of cell in a cancer. You got well oxygenated cancer cells and poorly oxygenated cancer cells, and then cells that are growing in a pH environment that's low. Although the pH may be high inside the cell, it's the surrounding tissue. And so here's three different types of cells in this one cancer. And so if you devise a therapy that will go after, oftentimes it will only affect one or two of these types of cells, but not the third. And you wind up, these cells die off, and this one continues to grow happily on its way. And the doctor says, I'm sorry, you seem to be resistant to the therapy, the radiation or the chemo. So we find that this acid-resistant cells have powerful growth advantage, which promotes unconstrained proliferation and invasion. I pretty much said that in different words. So we find that upregulation of glycolysis requires that cancer cells control their internal acidity, and they do this by pumping out the hydrogen ions and the lactate and creating the acid environment surrounding the cancer. So they create these transporters. The DNA now will be signaled, and it will genetically express proteins that will travel to the surface of the cell or to be created and travel to the surface of the cell. And now these act as transporters that dump out this acid waste that's being prominently developed. This is basically like the muffler system on the car. The engine's burning oil, and you get poorly burning the gas. You got all this blue smoke, and the smoke's coming out, and it's not staying in the engine. It's coming out through the muffler, and now it's going out into the environment. You're breathing it as you're driving behind this blue smoking car. And so this whole area becomes toxic, and this because the cells are actually dumping these materials. You know what? Let's take about a 3-minute break and let everybody go to the bathroom. And so we're going to take about a 3-minute break, and then we're going to continue. So we'll stop here for a moment. Okay, we're going to get back started here. So as the tumor cell creates an acid environment around itself, or the tumor produces an acid environment, it destroys normal cells as well as promotes the sprouting out of blood vessels into the tumor. Now, cancer is noted for abnormalities in pH, typically in the tissues around the tumor, and we find immune function is compromised when there is excessive acidity. And so we find that this is the activity of an enzyme. There's a certain pH number where the enzyme is most active, and if it goes too low or too high past that, the enzyme becomes less active. The same thing can happen for a cell. So we say, instead of an enzyme, we say this is an immune cell. We'll find that certain pH, so if the tumor pH falls too far, or the tissue around the tumor falls too far, the immune cell activity will decline. And so we find immune system function can be compromised by this acidity. The acidity also increases resistance to chemotherapy and promotes metastatic spread of tumors. And so we find that cancer cells can actually increase their internal pH to an alkaline state as opposed to normal cells, which tend to be a little bit more acidic on the interior than a cancer cell. It's strange, but that's the way it is. But the outside of the cell has very low pH. So several people have come up with different therapies. One way is to, there's called insulin potentiation therapy, where a doctor will give a IV of glucose and insulin. This doesn't sound right because we're already saying keep glucose away from the cancer, but this is a rapid infusion of high concentration of glucose and insulin. So you drive a lot of glucose into the cell, you overwhelm the cell with too much acidity, and it kills the cell. So it's faster than the cell can pump it out. So that's why this works, insulin potentiation therapy. However, other people will address this external acidosis with sodium bicarbonate. There are doctors that give sodium bicarbonate IVs, and there are therapies out there where people are taking sodium bicarb orally and reducing the extracellular acidosis. These are things you have to check out. So you find that cells that are in a glycolytic state are more resistant to hypoxia. They have higher lactate secretion. They have higher external acidity, and this metabolic pathway provides the materials needed for the cell to reproduce itself. Now, hypoxic conditions with tumor will activate signaling pathways. We've already talked about this. This one is vascular endothelial growth factor, which means it causes tumor blood vessels to sprout. And so this helps initiate tumor cell invasion, migration. So we find that hypoxic cells are normally resistant to chemotherapy and radiation. So here we find the hypoxic cells, these cells are killed off by chemo and radiation. This population survives, enters the bloodstream, and metastasizes, and because they're more active metastatically, and so you find out the person has had chemo, and then 18 months later, the doctor says the cancer has come back, and by the way, it's spread. Now it's in your bones and your liver and your brain. And this is because they've killed off the oxygenated tumor cells, but their therapies were ineffective on this hypoxic population. So tumor cells activate a lack of oxygen, release these growth factors, angiogenic factors, that cause sprouting of the blood vessels, and this will allow the tumor to get blood and nutrients. It also allows a pathway for spread of the tumor to distant parts. So hypoxia predisposes tumor invasion and metastatic processes. And this is the tumor that is spreading. We've already talked about these glucose transporters that are upregulated. We've already talked about the increased release out of the tumor of these acidic waste processes, acidic materials. So we'll just skip this. We already covered this. Now, alkaline diets generally seem to help. And it's my opinion that tumors, that you're basically with an alkaline diet, you're starting to correct the acidity outside of the tumor, but you're not necessarily affecting the acidity or the pH of the interior of the tumor that much. Some, but not as much as you would like. Because we find that tumor cells can grow when the intracellular pH is either acidic or alkaline. If the intracellular pH will play a role in switching between whether the tumor uses glucose and oxygen or no oxygenated metabolism. So glucose may break down without oxygen. And so we find that tumor cells can switch from one type to another. They can switch with an alkaline pH inside the tumor, which will drive glycolysis, and they can go to an acidic pH inside the tumor, and it'll switch to oxygen utilization. And the interesting thing is tumor cells can switch in little as an hour from one of these states to another. This is why they're so resistant to chemo and radiation, because you've got cells of different types and different metabolisms. So let's see, we've already talked about reduction of potassium and magnesium. We've already talked about how the tumor will dump out its acids and make itself alkaline. And we've already talked about how sodium enters the tumor. In general, intracellular pH elevation occurs when the tumor cells have created enough of these transport mechanisms to dump out excessive hydrogen ions or acidity, and so the tumor becomes alkaline in pH in the interior. And this is accompanied, when you dump out these hydrogen ions, this is accompanied by the depletion of potassium inside tumor cells as well as magnesium. So this is part of the process involved. Now, what I think happens is when you supply potassium and magnesium, you actually are counteracting this trend to some degree, which is one of the reasons why high potassium vegetable diets seem to have ability to slow growth of tumors. Now, high sodium content is involved in regulation and control of cell divisions, and we find that the sodium-potassium membrane pump is impaired in cancer cells, leading to high levels of sodium in the interior and low levels of potassium and magnesium. Now, there's something called Gerson therapy, which has been criticized for many decades by the American Cancer Society, among others. Interestingly enough, if you look up the American Cancer Society, you'll find that most of their funding comes from pharmaceutical industry, as well as agricultural conglomerates that are involved in processed foods. So they're really, I don't feel, a independent source of information. They're more of a trade union or a I don't think of the right word, a trade unit which promotes certain processes or certain agendas. It's not an independent organization is what I'm trying to say. All right, so Gerson believed cancer changed the body's normal sodium-potassium balance, which has been proven since he died by many doctors and researchers. So his therapy used low sodium foods, high potassium, rich in vitamins, and rich in enzymes. And so he believed that you had to eliminate excessive salt. He also eliminated sugar. So basically it was a generally mostly vegetarian to probably completely vegetarian diet. Okay, we've already talked about this. Okay, so we find that we've already talked about the acidity, we've talked about the pH changes. Now we find that flavonoids such as quercetin and the grape extract, resveratrol, although it comes from other products besides grapes, will inhibit the glucose transport mechanism, the lactate export mechanism, and will inhibit the growth of tumor cells. So we find that natural substances that are found in vegetables, herbs, And fruits. Now, we don't recommend diets high in fruits because there's too much sugar, but we certainly recommend these extracts of these fruits as part of a supplement program. And so these actually will start going after the very mechanisms that cancer cells need to grow, survive, and proliferate. And so you actually are able to knock out the glucose transport or reduce glucose transport. You're actually able to reduce the cell's ability to dump out its acids. So as a result, the acids, instead of accumulating, stay inside the tumor and literally smother it to death. And so you can actually start killing cancer. If you look up resveratrol, you'll find that there's a lot of studies now, cell cultures and animal experiments where this is and has anti-cancer properties. And there are literally hundreds of these herbs and vegetable and fruit extracts that have been found to have cancer inhibition properties, especially one called curcumin. So we find that numerous studies show that berry and fruit extracts promote apoptosis or cell death. So we don't recommend the fruits because of the high sugar, but you can use acai extracts, blackberry, wolfberry, grapes, pomegranates, figs, tomatoes, melons, olive oil, olives, and these active compounds act on these molecular targets to treat cancers and other diseases. So not only do they have effect on cancer, they have effect on brain diseases, cardiovascular diseases, musculoskeletal diseases, a whole host of these conditions. Now we find what causes cancer. We're finding that the majority of human tumors are caused by chemical substances in the environment. We're now exposed to over 70,000 compounds that are being released by manufacturing in the environment. It's probably closer to about 120. Because this is a 1999 paper, and I've seen much higher levels. So we have these compounds in the lining of your cans. I think it's called BPA, but I might get that wrong. You find phthalates in plastic bottles and floor tile. You got vinyl floor coverings. You got like a 1 out of 5 times higher chance of getting autism in a kid just by having vinyl floors. And so these plasticizers that are in all these containers, the canned foods, preservatives, and then all the stuff's in the air and the water and the pollution. I mean, you cannot go to a major city now and drink the water and not found it's loaded with hundreds of drugs because they reuse the water. They take the water, they clean it, and then they pump it back into the people, out of these reservoirs, and they're now finding that people are getting very small amounts of lots of drugs, such as estrogen compounds, and you're getting your Prozac in your water. And so we're being exposed to chemicals coming and going. This is why detoxification is an absolute necessity. In my opinion, any cancer doctor that doesn't talk to you about detoxification is not doing a good job. I could even go so far as saying, in my opinion, it's malpractice, but I'm far out there. So we're all exposed to foreign substances that often occur in very low concentrations, but they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. But the problem occurs because of what's called bioaccumulation. So let's say we have a smelter over here that is putting out, or a waste disposal process furnace. And, they're burning waste, and it goes into the atmosphere, and it's got a lot of cadmium, and it's got a lot of mercury, and it's got a lot of lead, but in very small doses. But it's constantly putting out. So here, this whole area over here, hundreds of square miles is being exposed to this lead, mercury, cadmium, and other chemicals. They're going and floating down into the soil. And then plants grow. You go to your vegetable garden, you go to your tomatoes, and these things will bioaccumulate 5, 10, 100 times the level that's in the soil. So now you go eat the tomato, you just got 100 times what you would have got if you breathed it in. But you're breathing it in also, and it's accumulated that way. And so this is just one example. And the same thing happens with fish in the sea. They're eating the algae are being exposed to these chemicals. The small fish eat shrimps and things, eat the algae. The small fish eat the shrimps. And then the larger fish, like swordfish and tuna, eat the small fish. And these things have 50, 100, 200 times the concentrations of lead, mercury, other toxins in them than you down here at the krill and the algae had. So this is called bioaccumulation, or biomagnification is you're passing the material and concentrating it higher up the food chain you go. So anyway, you get it from growing plants, you get it from eating up the food chain. So the higher on the food chain, the more concentrated the toxins. So a vigorous approach to detoxification is critical to the treatment of cancer. And I already said that I feel like detoxification is one of the most important aspects of cancer treatment. Now, another thing that we want to be concerned about are clots. And clots are the second leading cause of death in cancer. Why? Because malignant conditions are associated with what are called hypercoagulable states. It means the blood becomes sticky. It's because the tumor cells will actually secrete materials that cause the blood cells to stick together. And so you wind up having lots of chemicals involved in this process. And one of the things that these chemicals do is to promote some growth of new blood vessels, but that's not where we're going here. So fibrin is a natural protein that's in soluble form called fibrinogen. And when you have cut yourself and the blood starts leaking out, you have chemicals that are released from platelets as well as the broken blood cell wall. And fibrinogen is enzymatically cleaved into a product called fibrin, which is an insoluble protein. It creates a lattice. And so basically it starts trapping the white cells and the red cells. And so it now forms a clot. But what happens is the tumor cells will actually create these clotted areas, and it provides a stroma or a lattice structure to support growth of the tumor. So we find that cancer creates increased levels of coagulation proteins, particularly fibrin, and this fibrin will actually deposit on cancer cells, but it also deposits on the white cells, the macrophages, lymphocytes, and neutrophils, and basically starts clogging up their surface. And so we find that the tumor cell has created a stealth coat by using the host's own proteins on its cell surface. So it's kind of it's gone into an ability to hide itself in plain sight. So here's a tumor cell, and it starts coating itself with this sticky material. And here's these white cells. They get coated with sticky material, and they really don't see the tumor anymore. All they see is this normal material that the body naturally produces, so they don't attack. So a coated tumor cell appears as self to the immune system and thus is not detected as a tumor by the immune system. So we got what's called a shielding effect by blocking the adherence and cytotoxicity of immune cells. So what happens is an immune cell, let's say here's this immune cell, it would actually bond to this tumor cell if it was functioning normally, and it will digest the cell membrane, and it will dump toxic enzymes into the tumor cell and kill it. So it's basically an injection like a hypodermic needle, and it dumps in a bunch of enzymes and it digests the tumor and kills it. So we find that platelet aggregation also occurs. That increases cancer cell survival, providing a shielding protection. So not only do we have the fibrin material shielding the cancer, we also have these aggregated platelets. And so these will also perform a natural barrier and prevent the binding and attack of immune cells like NK killer cells. So hypercoagulation provides immune protection for cancer. So tumor cells prevent themselves by being recognized, also by antibodies, same process, by shedding soluble surface antigens. These antibodies become bound, creating immune complexes, and you wind up finding that the cancer cells and immune cells are all coated with these materials. Now, fortunately, you can use enzyme therapy and as what's called a de-shielding. And enzyme therapy goes back to the turn of the 20th century. There was a guy named John Beard that developed enzymes and injected them into cancers and found the cancers would dissolve. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these enzymes can't be used that way because they can cause anaphylactic reactions and some people die. So they quit doing it because some people live, some people died. But you can take oral enzymes, pancreatic enzymes, plant extracts such as bromelain, which comes out of pineapple, papain, which comes out of papaya, and enzymes in raw fruits and vegetables, primarily your vegetables, will provide the ability to de-shield these cancer cells. So we're going to look at, we've got this clot formed, and it will block off, and all of a sudden the tumor now will spread out of this, inside of this blood vessel to other areas. So tumors will promote the formation of microthrombi, and microthrombi are small blood clots, and they grow to big thrombi, macrothrombi, and let's say it goes into the heart, causes heart attack, goes into the blood vessels of the brain, it causes a stroke, goes into the blood vessels of the feet and causes ulcers of the feet, or infarcts of the feet, or go to the liver, causes a liver infarct or kidney infarct. The point is, you get a spread of these microthrombi in tumor. This is why I feel like any cancer therapy patient needs to be on an enzyme program. So we find that metastasis requires the cancer to escape from the primary tumor, survive in circulation, and seed at distant sites. And activated platelets activate the coagulation process, increase vascular permeability, tumor growth. And so we find that excessive coagulation promotes cancer spread, and removing this coagulation will reduce the spread of metastases. So we find that binding of fibrin-coated tumor cells to activated platelets is necessary for adhesion to the blood vessel wall. And so you're actually, when you start using these enzymes and you break off these platelets and break off this fibrin, you actually prevent this adhesion process. You reduce metastases. I think we covered this. Let's see. Yeah, we've covered this, so I'm going to keep going. Now, another thing that creates immune suppression is acidity. Immune responses is suppressed under acidic conditions. So as we talked about earlier, as a tumor creates an acidic environment outside of itself, the immune cells just really have trouble getting into this area. It slows down their biological processes. So it inhibits the functions of lymphocytes, leukocytes, killer cells. And so an acidic extracellular matrix, or external to the tumor, along with coagulation shielding, explains why tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes and macrophages accumulate at the site of tumors but cannot effectively attack the tumor cells. So you find if you cut open a cancer, it's often loaded with these white cells, but they're basically sitting there like they were anesthetized, and they just can't do the job. They're inactivated by these shielding materials. They're inactivated by the pH. So pH and inflammatory conditions are common, and infections are another leading cause of death in cancer. Now we see the pH, and this coagulation process has shut down the immune system. We find now the immune system is shut down generally, so it has trouble fighting off viruses and bacteria. And so we find that this will also promote multi-chemo drug resistance. So these pH alterations, inflammatory conditions, will promote resistance to chemo. They impair the function of the immune system. And we find the function of the immune system is worsened by use of radiation and chemo. So now we're taking the immune system and really kicking it in the head. And so people will get infections that are not often recognized till they're life-threatening. My granddad gets a cough, and 12 to 24 hours later, he's got confluent pneumonia in both lungs, and he's in the intensive care unit. You go, I can't understand. He was fine 2 days ago, and Now all of a sudden he can't breathe. That's because he's got this pneumonia that just went crazy all through his body. And sometimes people get sepsis. And there's a great source of bacteria coming out of the gut because all these people that are on chemo and radiation have dysbiosis or bad bacteria in their gut, and they've lost their normal immune protective functioning of normal bacteria. And so you get all this bacteria, all of a sudden they invade into the bloodstream, and now you got somebody who is has a blood-borne infection or sepsis. So strategies that can help this are an alkaline diet, control inflammation, which we'll get into later, and use these enzymes to help with immune defense. So cancer shielding, you got fibrin and platelet coatings, the antigen antibody complexes, and you got the shield of pH. All reduce the immune system function, and so the normalization of these physiological conditions will help counteract the immunosuppressive and invasive supportive effects of tumor environment. Okay, let's see. So tumor cells in the bloodstream are naturally destroyed by proper functioning of the immune system. And so what we want to do is we want to bring that immune system back. And here's a T cell actively glommed on to this cancer cell, and they actually fuse, but if there's a shield between the two, it can't fuse. So it's actually blocked. That's why you call it a shielding effect. So we want to use enzymes that are natural in plants or pancreatic enzymes or both. Most therapies that are effective in cancer use a combination of pancreatic and pancreatic enzymes along with bromelain and papain. Some people also add in nattokinase and several other enzyme products. So macrophage killing a cancer cell. We see this macrophage is bonded on to this cancer cell. There's another one over here. And it is fusing, and then it's injecting these materials. So that's why shielding is protective and deshielding can help. So we want to promote T cell and macrophage killing of cancer. Now, allopaths, regular classically trained doctors, will usually use anticoagulants, heparin and Coumadin. And they find that these are anticoagulants because they want to control the coagulation that occurs in cancer, chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery. Now, the problem with using these anticoagulants is you need intensive coagulation monitoring. There's a wide variation in how much is needed. That's called the dose-response interaction. There are multiple drug interactions, so usually there's more than one drug on board. They call in a specialist. He adds us a drug, and all of a sudden the coagulation therapy goes crazy, and you can get platelet depletion and serious bleeding and death. And there's quite a few people that die. I think about 8,000 people a year die from aspirin, which is an anticoagulant. Enzymes, in my opinion, are far safer, but I don't think you should use them with anticoagulants at the same time. So the choice is one or the other. There are antiplatelet agents out there, and there's some newer ones that are being marketed on TV now. And they're basically being marketed for cardiovascular disease, but I guarantee you within 2 or 3 years, if they stay on the market, they're going to be marketed for anti-cancer because they're going to try to reduce this sticky coagulation effect. However, there are natural substances that you can use that will reduce the stickiness of the platelets. Tomato extracts are the highest activity. Tomato sauce, tomato paste. Actually, cooking the tomatoes has a high activity of the lycopene, but raw tomatoes are very good, and they don't have a lot of sugar. And then there's grapefruit, melon, and strawberry. Fish oils will have the ability to reduce the stickiness. Flaxseed oil, garlic, nattokinase is an enzyme, turmeric, also known as curcumin, N-acetylcysteine, green tea extracts, and then you have your enzymes, proteolytic enzymes, pancreatic enzymes, bromelain, papain, are also fibrinolytic and anti-inflammatory. So enzyme therapy, we talked about cancer cells coated with this fibrin. Here it's all coated with the fibrin, protects against the immune system. And so then the theory is using fibrolytic enzymes. Chymotrypsin and trypsin are pancreatic enzymes. Papain, bromelain are fibrinolytic enzymes. They come from papaya and pineapple. So these enzymes are typically given orally in combination mixtures at high doses every 4 to 6 hours. And a high dose enzyme therapy needs to be done under the care of a doctor that knows what he's doing. But most people can tolerate some level of enzymes. Proteolytic enzymes remove the fibrin shields. Now they allow the immune cells to fuse and destroy the cancer cells. These protein coats also reduce the penetration of drugs, so we find that enzyme therapy actually makes drug therapy work better, and they have done studies with enzymes and chemo and found the chemo worked better. What a shock. But, instead of the doctor saying, oh, I don't want you to use any nutritional therapy, it's going to interfere with the drug therapy, they don't know the literature that the nutritional therapy is going to make their drug therapy work better. And that's just because there's too much literature. There's literally, let's say there's 100 million medical articles. Okay? So we got 100 million. What is that, 10 to the 7th? Or is it 10 to the 8th? Let's see. Boy, I'm getting lost here. Let's say 7th for a minute. No, that's 10 million, so it'd be 10 to 8. Okay. We got 10 to the 8th. Now, an average doctor in his lifetime might understand 100,000 articles. That's about 10 to the 5th. That means a well-read doctor that had 50 years being a doctor will know 1/1000th of the medical literature. That means you can literally have 1,000 doctors out there that have never heard of anything the other 1,000 have ever heard of. Now, that's generally not how it works, but from a point of view of an explanation, it's fascinating when you begin to realize that this doctor might know all about this over here, and this doctor might know a little bit of what he knows, but this over here, but most of them don't have much in common. And this doctor over here may know all this stuff here, but doesn't know anything what these other doctors are talking about. And so what happens is when you get into alternative medicine and natural medicine, you find there's this whole bunch of literature over here that none of these other doctors are reading. So they don't know anything about what I'm talking about. And the only reason I know about it is because I spent 32 years reading about it and going to lectures and seminars, conferences, taking courses. So systemic enzyme therapy in cancer will reduce cytokines, reduce cell signaling, reduce growth factors, have anti-inflammatory effects, will reduce blood vessel growth, angiogenesis, will enhance immune cell activity, can help reduce lymphatic edema, and can reduce the side effects of chemo and radiation. And these are the major enzymes. Proteolytic enzyme administered as a complementary treatment in chemo and radiation notably reduces specific symptoms of nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, diarrhea, headache, fatigue, depression, sleep disturbances, and restlessness, improves digestion, improves nutrient absorption, and improves survival time. Yet the doctors say don't take the medicine, the nutrients, because it's going to interfere with drug therapy. They didn't read the right literature. So why does enzyme work when tumors use enzymes to spread? I'm getting to more of a technical topic. Tumors will actually secrete enzymes to spread themselves, and the reason enzyme therapy works is because it digests the enzymes that tumors release. Okay, that's inactivating these cancer proteases. Okay, let's see. We've got some other things to cover. Natural compounds that can inhibit cancer cell migration. D3, one of the most important compounds, recently, it's been known for a long time, but recently hitting the literature, mainstream literature even, about the anti-cancer effect of vitamin D3. And so there are available tests now to check your D3 levels. Life Extension Foundation, LEF.org. You can go to there and look in their laboratory section and get some information. Or you can just go to their website and put in vitamin D3 and read for the next 2 weeks on all the information they're starting to collect. But there's lots of places. The Health Ranger, Mike Adams, has lots of articles on his site on vitamin D3. Dr. Mercola.com has lots of articles, not only on D3, but on cancer, natural therapies. So all of these sites have information that is beneficial for somebody that's just getting into this. Quercetin, bromelain, EPA, DHA, melatonin, all these are involved, can reduce this cancer cell migration. So they actually can inactivate this spreading. It's like an amoeba. And so it has ability to restrain these surface adhesion protein legs. Now this is the historical, Dr. John Beard discovered pancreatic proteolytic enzymes for effective treatment for cancer. There was a guy named William Donald Kelly, treated himself with terminal pancreatic cancer. He was told to go home in the early 60s to die. He had pancreatic cancer. Basically, you can take a census of pancreatic cancer in 5 years in a phone booth. I mean, literally, you know, if you got 100 people with pancreatic cancer in 5 years, you can take the census in the phone booth of how many lived. Almost nobody lives from pancreatic cancer. Yet he cured himself, and he worked with 15,000 clients that he helped recover from cancer over his career. There's a guy named Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez who's continued to advance his therapy. You can look him up. So there's a number of DVDs and books that Dr. Gonzalez has written about metabolic typing, diet, supplements, enzyme therapy, and cancer. In chemotherapy studies, response to treatment is defined as a 50% or greater reduction in tumor size that lasts at least 4 weeks. But as I've mentioned earlier, many chemo drugs will shrink the tumor, but patients live no longer than if they had received no therapy, although they do have a $200,000 medical bills that their family has to pay for. And the biggest cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical illness. So chemotherapy now and radiation and cancer treatments can now cost upwards of $200,000 to $800,000 a year. And there's a new cancer drug that's just came out, and each dose is $110,000 per dose. So you say, the doctor says, you need 7 treatments of this drug. And you go, okay, doc, let's do it. And the next thing you know, you got a $770,000 medical bill after X number of weeks. You're going, what on earth has happened to me? Of course, your insurance will cover this all but 20%. And I don't know if you want to calculate how much 20% of $770,000 is, but I guarantee you it's a pretty high number. So we find that tumor reduction in chemo generally does not translate into longer life for the patient. I think that's fascinating. Why? Because drug-responsive cells die and drug-resistant cells live, producing a more virulent cancer that grows explosively. So measuring tumor size may ultimately be meaningless. Stabilization and survival times are the measures of importance. Yeah, the tumor doctor says, hey, your tumor's shrinking. That's great. It doesn't really mean anything. What it means is, are you going to live longer? That's what's important. So we've already talked about, we're going to skip that. Okay, so we've already talked about all this. Excessive acidity. Okay, acid-producing foods lower the body's pH. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to use alkaline-producing foods. Kidneys buffer acidity by excreting minerals and ammonia. Acid diets cause the bones to release calcium, magnesium, as well as all the heavy metals that have been there since you're a child and later. And this is what the bones release. The muscles are broken down to produce ammonia, which is strongly alkaline. So bone minerals and ammonia get excreted in the urine. Heavy metals accumulate in the kidneys, and you get a rise in blood pressure. This is why many people, and women particularly as they hit menopause and they start breaking their bones down, start developing hypertension, because the heavy metals that are stored in the bones go to the kidneys. And the kidneys use a compound called glutathione to dump the heavy metals. But if you get too much of this stuff coming in and your body can't produce glutathione, these heavy metals accumulate in the kidneys and you get hypertension. So we find that consumption of refined grains, sugars, cooked meats produces increased acid load, exactly the opposite diet than you need to be eating. And so processed foods and packaged foods are so they have so many acid-forming foods, the body can't excrete all the acidity, and so what happens is store some of the acidity for later, and we already know that's going to further complicate the immune system. It's just not good. It's also going to cause the body to lose more of its minerals, which are already a problem, and so you're losing magnesium, potassium in your bicarbonate stores. So you basically want to use minerals, and some people will, I don't recommend you use sodium bicarbonate till you read about it a little bit, but oral sodium bicarbonate has been found to be helpful in some cases of cancer, and it doesn't seem to have much side effect. And there, you can look this up. Fruits and vegetables are rich in potassium, magnesium, which are natural pH buffers. High protein meat-based diets release the acids. Grains, wheat, rye, corn also have an acidic effect, and even the GMO may have even more of an effect. And we find the metabolism of alkaline salts in fruits and vegetables supply large amounts of magnesium, potassium, and help balance the effect of the acidity. Addressing the extracellular acidity that occurs around tumors is important, and it has some effect, but it's not the whole thing in itself. So alkaline minerals, sodium bicarbonate, some people even recommend apple cider vinegar. I recommend alkaline diets, alkaline minerals, mixed enzyme formulas, and I'm open to apple cider vinegar and sodium bicarbonate. Systemic alkalization is effective as a cancer treatment in some studies. Serum concentration of sodium bicarbonate can increase by oral ingestion. Consequent reduction in tumor acid concentration significantly reduces tumor growth and invasion without altering the pH of blood or normal tissues. This is Silva's report on sodium bicarbonate therapy in cancer. All right, so that's dipstick. Cancer diets, I just went through a few of them. The World Cancer Research Fund reports a reduction in red meat. Predominant diet of whole foods. That means don't eat processed packaged foods. Shop on the outside aisles of your grocery store. Don't go in the inside aisle and buy the packaged foods. Increase fruit and vegetable consumption. I recommend high vegetable consumption and fruit extracts to reduce the sugar. Moderate your alcohol intake. They recommend other things are alkaline diet, metabolic diet, the fat protein diet of Johanna Budwig. So in my opinion, red meat is not bad for you, but fuzzy green meat is bad for you. Basically, you want to reduce the meat. General recommendations are 80% alkaline, metastatic disease, 100% alkaline. There are many books on alkaline diets. Alkaline diets may include sprouts, vegetables, root vegetables, but not so much carrots. Freshly squeezed juice freshly juiced vegetable juice, alkaline nuts, almonds or hazelnuts, essential fatty acids, flaxseed oil, borage oil, virgin olive oil. That was another one I meant to mention earlier. Really good diet. Eliminate your soy oil, your canola oil, your corn oil, your cottonseed oil. Avocados are good. Lemons are good. Raw alkaline diets work because pH changes, the mineralization, the low sugar content, presence of high concentrations of enzymes, and the flavonoids, which we've already mentioned. And the flavonoid family includes many different compounds, flavonoids, flavones, isoflavones, catechins, I probably can't even say that word, anthocyanidins. All these compounds have been found to have anti-cancer effect. There's over 10,000 articles on PubMed that describe the cancer preventative and cancer treating effects of flavonoids. I looked it up, and that's how many I saw. Mostly raw food diets will have pH support, alkaline minerals, good enzymes, low in sugar, low in glutamine, support detox, are low in bad fats, and are high in the flavonoids. And these are some of the books. And we already talked about tumors consuming a higher rate of glucose, which is why most cancer diets use a low glycemic index. You know, we're really kind of out of time here. I guess I can go for a few minutes more. I think I probably got about 15 more minutes in this presentation, so I'm going to skip over a few slides, but just to kind of get through it. Inflammation has a big role in cancer and contributes to cancer development, and controlling inflammation is good. And so we're probably going to focus on substances that control inflammation. Inflammation will promote cell transformation through DNA damage. So basically it can cause a normal tissue to go into cancer tissue. And inflammatory areas are acidic and depleted of nutrients and oxygen. Well, basically that's just what we don't want. We don't want an acidic, low oxygen state because that is promoting cancer, and that's what happens with inflammatory areas. So a person with chronic inflammation has a higher chance of getting cancer, and this also leads to immune dysregulation, which is another thing that can cause spread of cancer. So chronic inflammation associated with increased risk of cancers is associated with the microenvironmental alteration, which is also present in cancer development. An inflammatory microenvironment is critical for tumor cell growth and spread. So therapies must be directed at controlling cancer inflammation and reducing the smoldering inflammation that supports tumor progression, and in my opinion, using natural bioactive compounds that can exert anti-inflammatory activity. So omega-3 fatty acids from fish and flaxseed oil promote anti-inflammatory effects, whereas omega-6 fatty acids from dairy and meat and certain vegetable oils lead to pro-inflammatory effect. Now, I'm not completely against dairy, although some cancer doctors recommend no dairy. Fermented dairy seems to be better tolerated, like cottage cheese, than regular milk. But it does have a little bit of inflammation, but it does have some other value also, so you have to keep that in perspective. The transformation of fatty acids into prostaglandins are dependent upon enzymes that will manufacture substances that are, and I'm just going to skip over this, that have inflammatory activity. Okay. Inhibition of inflammation, that's what we want. Curcumin, turmeric, present in a lot of curries, is a very powerful anti-inflammatory. So if you've got a cardiovascular disease, a brain disease, tendency toward Alzheimer's disease, or cancer, this is a very powerful compound. I don't use green lip mussels as much. They're very expensive. I think curcumin's a better availability, and it's cheaper, and it's very effective. And there are literally thousands of articles on the beneficial effects of curcumin on the body. Flavonoids I use a lot of. Green tea, red wine, resveratrol, onions, apples have numerous anti-inflammatory effects, as well as being potent antioxidants. Chronic inflammation is associated with dramatic shifts in tissue metabolism, depletion of nutrients, hypoxia, which we really don't want, oxidative stress, accumulation of inflammatory immune cells, but then you get development of acidosis, which suppresses the immune cell activity, activation of angiogenic factors, and you get tissue damage. So inflammation fighters, curcumin and green tea, these are fish oils, flavonoids, garlic, resveratrol, antioxidants. Melatonin is very important. You might want to look into using melatonin at bedtime, 3 to 9 milligrams. You might, if you get sedated, go to 1 milligram, work your way from 1 to 3. Some people get real groggy on melatonin. Other people don't notice anything until they hit 9 milligrams. Vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E. So natural compounds that are anti-inflammatory and anti-angiogenic, means they stop blood vessels sprouting, that have antioxidants, all help drive the macrophages toward the mode of attacking cancer cells. So the implications of diet therapies work by controlling acidosis, controlling inflammation, improving immune function, reducing oxidative stress, detoxifying the tissues, improving hypoxia, correcting nutrient depletion, correcting mineral depletion, and controlling inflammation. So all the cancer diets I reviewed indicated that foods which contributed to high blood insulin levels and high blood sugars and refined flour products should be eliminated. Raw foods are preferable. 85% of studies that queried raw vegetables found a protective effect. You need to have high omega-3 fatty acids. Get rid of your omega-6s generally. You can grind your flaxseed up to make fresh ground flaxseed. And I think we finished. You reached the last page of the internet. Thank you very much. You know, I'm going to mention LifeWave products for a moment. I'm the director of research for LifeWave. It's www.lifewave.com. But if you want to look at products, you go to www.lwpatch.com. You can also call Chris at 630-503-7620. We make patches that have pain controlling effects, energy effects, antioxidant effects, sleep promoting effects. We've got over 68 medical studies. We've spent $2 million on research. Many of our studies are on the website. lwpatch.com is a good site. But what I really wanted to mention is we just brought out a new product yesterday, a cell phone protector. Now, we tested our cell phone protector against 15 other cell phone protectors on the market, and none of them others worked. Now, our cell phone protector is called Matrix. It was tested by an independent research laboratory that does all the medical testing for medical products in Europe. And they came back and found that our cell phone protector reduces cell phone radiation by about 85%. You don't want to reduce it to 0 because then you won't have any cell phone service. But the cell phone protector right now is only available for iPhone products. We're going to have 5 other models. Each cell phone protector has to be unique for the cell phone that it's being produced for in order to control the antenna radiation, which is where you get most of your radiation. So what you want to do is you want to look at this as a very powerful protection. You only need one for your phone for the lifetime of the phone. But this cell phone protection is going to be one of the most exciting products that we've ever seen. And based on stealth bomber technology, it uses materials that have microwave absorption technology. It comes out of declassified research. So we use materials that were classified 25 years ago now to make our cell phone protectors out of. So if you're interested in looking at LifeWave products, go to lwpatch.com, www.lwpatch.com, or you can call Chris at 630-503-7620. I really gave this lecture not as a method of promoting our products, but I thought I'd mention it. Thank everybody for attending, and good night.